Hey guys, back with another video log, and very special guest today. I've known this guy for, what, 10 years now?
At least 10 years. I mean, we met a little over 10 years ago, but I
go back to the bodybuilding.com forums.
Yeah.
So this is Professor Dom D'Agostino, and Dom is known as basically one of the foremost researchers of the ketogenic diet in the world. And like I said, we first met online on the bodybuilding.com forums. You were DPD 555, is that right?
Something like that, yeah.
Different
names.
Yeah, and I was Straight Flex back in those days.
Yeah.
And, I remember we were going to meet at a scientific conference, and everybody kept saying, man, good luck, Layne. Good luck. Like, train together. And I'm like, wow, strong guy. And I see him, doing chest flies with 120s, and a man crush was forever born. So... but that's not, we're not here to reminisce today. We're here to talk about the ketogenic diet because I get a lot of questions from you guys about the ketogenic diet. And I also get a lot of misunderstanding of my position on the ketogenic diet. A lot of people say, Layne, you hate the ketogenic diet, or you said the ketogenic diet doesn't work. And that's not true. But first, and I actually have had people say, how can you be friends with Dom? He promotes the ketogenic diet. And I said, I'm not anti-keto. I'm not anti-intermittent fasting. I'm only anti-bullshit. That's the only thing I'm anti for. So, but I figured, what better way to kind of educate people than to have somebody who is perceived as anti-keto with somebody who is perceived as pro-keto.
Or a keto fits all applications
perspective,
which I certainly don't have. So,
yeah, exactly.
I think people think these polarizing opinions tend to create a lot of an online community that debate each other, and it's entertaining to some degree, but kind of sad because they're misinterpreting the big picture.
Yeah. So let's talk about it for a second. So first off, kind of give us the brief background of how you got involved with the ketogenic diet and specifically its applications like cancer, seizures, Alzheimer's. How did you kind of come by this?
Well, when I met you, what was I was studying? I was presenting. Do you remember? Actually, I think I was presenting the cancer article.
Yeah, it was your first
some
one.
Of the early ones.
Yeah.
So my original work was as a postdoctoral fellow after I did my PhD in neuroscience, looking at effects of hypoxia on the brain, was to look at the effects of hyperoxia on the brain, and that causes oxygen toxicity seizures. And we don't have a way to predict or prevent oxygen toxicity, which is a limitation for hyperbaric oxygen therapy and also Navy SEAL divers that use a closed-circuit rebreather. And so the first grant that I got was to basically develop technologies that allow us to, from a cellular and molecular level, understand what high-pressure oxygen does to cells. And in the process of developing the technologies and using it on a broad array of cell lines, we discovered that one of the things was that high oxygen can be damaging and actually can kill cancer cells. And another sort of thing that we discovered was that, or through my searching around, kind of what do people do that have tonic-clonic seizures, what do they do when drugs don't work, what are their options? And one was the ketogenic diet, which at the time, and this goes back almost 10 years ago, I thought I knew what the ketogenic diet was, actually, but in looking further, I realized that it was primarily a very high-fat diet. A classical ketogenic diet is 90% fat, and
I think that's a big misconception a lot of people have, and especially in the bodybuilding community. Yeah, it's not a high-protein diet.
So at the time, the modified ketogenic diet that was sort of further developed and advanced by Eric Kossoff at Johns Hopkins didn't really exist yet. So this ketogenic diet appeared to be very effective for managing seizures independent of the etiology. So independent of how these powerful seizures were produced, it had an anti-seizure, anti-convulsant effect, or neuroprotective effect against oxygen toxicity. It would appear, and the experts were telling me that it would be a good thing to study. So in the process,
what was the mechanism for that?
Of the ketogenic diet?
Yeah, for preventing seizures. Yeah.
So that's it's interesting because there's not one mechanism; it's many different mechanisms working in synchrony. So some of the things that we study are, well, without getting into the weeds, I think that it's important to acknowledge that ketones are a source of energy that your brain runs on when you're on a ketogenic diet. So, and they provide a source of energy for the brain, but they also have things like anti-inflammatory effects on the brain. They activate genes. When you're in a state of ketosis, it causes your brain to maintain homeostasis under conditions where it would otherwise have a neurometabolic failure, which would be high pressure oxygen, or if you have a brain tumor, or if you have hypoglycemia. So if you go to hypoglycemic shock with, for example, an injection of insulin would drop your blood glucose and you go hypoglycemic. It was observed back in 1967 in fasting patients that when they were given a dose of insulin that would be universally fatal, that people who had fasted were asymptomatic for hypoglycemia.
Shows how far IRBs have come.
Yeah, so that study actually was a powerful motivator for me to actually look at ketones as a neuroprotective substance, and maybe exogenous forms too is what we study. But that study was done by Dr. George Cahill, and Oliver Owen was a clinician that worked in the lab at the time. So, which is very interesting. They fasted patients for 40 days and did a series of studies on them, and in a clinical setting that was apparently approved by IRB, they injected 20 IUs of insulin and brought glucose down to 1 to 2 millimolar,
wow,
which causes seizures, coma, and could be fatal. But subjects were asymptomatic for hypoglycemia, and they didn't have brain damage, so, which was amazing. And this was in the medical literature and other similar reports like that. So it gave me, it was a very...
Especially because the reason they're not going into hypoglycemic shock, when you give a big load of insulin and you drive blood glucose down, mm-hmm. is that because if you're just using glucose, if that's your primary fuel, that fuel all of a sudden just runs out.
Yeah.
And whereas ketones give you an alternate fuel to switch to.
Starving your brain of its primary source of energy. And prior to 1965, it was thought that the brain could only use glucose exclusively as a source of energy. And in 1967, I think when that got published, it literally kind of changed our view of brain energy metabolism. So ketones could make the brain very resilient against extreme hypoglycemia, and it appears to make the brain stabilize brain energy metabolism and neurotransmission, which means the balance of neurotransmitters, under conditions that would typically cause a seizure. And that could be neurotoxic agents, what we study, high pressure oxygen, which causes oxygen toxicity seizures. And the etiology of epilepsy is largely unknown, and it's caused by many different things, and it seems to work almost universally across all different seizure types.
Wow.
So with that understanding, I became interested, and I guess you could say even obsessed with understanding, how can we leverage this alternative energy fuel that only is kind of produced in our body under very extreme circumstances of prolonged fasting or starvation, or this draconian ketogenic diet that was like eating, Crisco and lard and a little bit of protein just to, maintain muscle.
Yeah, people don't understand
but the diet has evolved significantly since then.
The traditional ketogenic diet is very hard to get to do that, because you're almost always going to get too much protein and carbohydrate. Like you're literally eating. Even something like bacon is probably a little bit too high protein for a 90% fat diet. You've literally got to eat butter, or peanut butter is even too high carb and too fat.
Normal sources would not be completely keto. You
right.
got to add fat to it.
So people don't realize that it's actually now the modified ketogenic diet that you're going to talk about, it's a little more reasonable. This is not it's not necessarily an easy thing to environment to create, is what he's trying to say.
And you don't want to try to implement it for the metabolic management of a clinical disorder without the use of a skilled dietitian, registered dietitian. So, and a registered dietitian that's savvy with the ketogenic diet, and they're kind of few and far between.
It's going to be hard to be nutritionally balanced with so much fat,
absolutely.
so little carbohydrate. That's one of the major drawbacks is vitamin and mineral deficiencies and whatnot. But obviously you can take a supplement for that too. But sorry, I've interrupted. Please continue with your thoughts on that.
All really valid points. Okay, so I was saying how I got into this. So, this idea of, understanding why these seizures occur, but more importantly, actually developing a mitigation strategy or a countermeasure to make special operations diving safer and to not impair their performance. So anti-epileptic drugs could be an option to prevent the potential for oxygen toxicity seizures, but obviously they impair performance and potentially safety too. So the ketogenic diet seemed like a pretty good option. At the time, our program manager, who's more or less controlling the money and the grants, didn't really like the idea of this high-fat ketogenic diet in a warfighter. So kind of reached out and said, your idea may have some merit if you develop a ketogenic diet in a drug, right? Or send us a report, send us some ideas on how to do that.
But in their defense, I mean, they may be looking from a field operational perspective. They may just be in a situation where they don't have access to that.
And implementation, right? So if you got a warfighter who needs to go down and do a mission, so the ketogenic diet takes 24, maybe 72 hours or more to get into a state of ketosis. It's the same thing with fasting. With an exogenous ketone, supplement, ester or salt or whatever, you could be in ketosis within an hour and then maintain that for hours to come. So that was sort of the idea. And it was observed that, people had been studying this. Actually, I saw that agencies like DARPA were funding labs at, for example, National Institutes of Health, Dr. Richard Veach, former student of Hans Krebs, the Krebs cycle, and researchers at Oxford University were doing some fantastic, work looking at the effects on exercise and other things in the heart. So that motivated me to determine what type of exogenous ketone could be synthesized and formulated, and we wanted to evaluate that in the lab that I show you today using various model systems, and to vet out what types of ketones would be most neuroprotective and anticonvulsant. So in the process of doing that, we discovered a ketone ester that was very potent in its ability to prevent seizures. And then since then, I would say, we're working with a wide variety of exogenous ketones that are formulated in different ways, and then that are in and of themselves, exogenous ketone, and then these are formulated together too to even be more potent, and they have different applications. So the only clinical application for the ketogenic diet when I started studying this was pediatric epilepsy. Mm-hmm. But if you do a Google search, you see extremely large increase in people searching about the ketogenic diet for other application, things like autism, things like, of course, type 2 diabetes may be the low-hanging fruit for people that can follow the ketogenic diet, and a whole host of neurological disorders too, and even just enhancing maybe brain energy and cognition in people that are older.
Do you think there's a common thread of providing some kind of alternate fuel source? I mean, obviously with like something like diabetes, type 1 diabetes, they can't really use glucose, and so they have to use exogenous insulin. So if you had somebody who's ketogenic, they theoretically could minimize or even discard insulin use because you're providing that alternate fuel.
So the risk you run, a type 1 diabetic can run the risk of diabetic ketoacidosis.
Right.
So without insulin, you have runaway ketogenesis, and you have the scenario where you have hyperglycemia and high ketones, and that creates the acidosis, and it could be fatal. That's a very dangerous situation. But if you do have type 1 diabetes and you follow a low carb, even a ketogenic diet approach, that will significantly reduce your dependence on insulin to where you are using, instead of 20 IUs a day, you could use 2 to 4 IUs a day and have much tighter blood glucose. Whenever you're using less insulin to manage type 1 diabetes and control your glucose, to me, that's
and I want to be clear too. A lot of people make a big deal about like ketogenic diet and ketoacidosis. That is only a situation where you have high insulin with high ketones.
In type 1 diabetics. So
yes,
insulin, in some rare cases, it can, in kids, they can become mildly, ketoacidotic, but usually you can correct that with electrolytes and fluids and things like that. But it's pretty much exclusively only a situation that would occur with insulin insufficiency that is characteristic of type 1 diabetes. So it's not a concern. Nutritional ketosis is distinctly different than diabetic ketoacidosis. Right. They are two separate things completely, for the most part.
Tell us about, so you kind of by accident stumble on the anti-cancer effects of the ketogenic diet. Yep. Can you explain a little bit about why you think the ketogenic diet or exogenous ketones seem to have, at least in some cell lines that you've studied, an anti-tumor effect?
Mm-hmm. So there's a variety of different reasons, and it is for complex and relatively simple. So I'll explain kind of the simple terms.
You can dumb it down for us. Yeah.
So some of the initial observations when I was touring you in the lab, we observed that cancer cells overproduce oxygen-free radicals in response to graded levels of oxygenation. So simply put, we studied a broad array of cell lines and we exposed them to different levels of oxygen. And a particular cell line that we were working with called U87 glioblastoma cells, or U87MG cells. These cells were kind of interesting because at the time I didn't fully acknowledge, that they came from a patient. I just was using them as an immortalized cell line to test various technologies for different reasons. But we observed that when exposed to oxygen, they overproduce free radicals and it damages the membrane and triggers cell death. And I didn't know why that was occurring. And when I delved into it, I kind of discovered that cancer cells that are particularly aggressive and glycolytic, which we were working with the brain tumor cell line, had what we would call Warburg phenotype. And Otto Warburg was a biochemist back almost 100 years ago, and kind of discovered metabolic differences between cells, normal cells and cancer cells. And his sort of theory, or kind of what has been shown in a wide variety of cancer cells, probably 80 to 90%, is that they have defective mitochondria or impaired oxidative phosphorylation, which is how mitochondria make energy for the cancer cells, and they have compensatory fermentation. And this basically means that they utilize substances outside, independent of the mitochondria, to make energy, to make ATP, glycolysis and substrate level phosphorylation to make ATP. So they were not, using, because they have damaged mitochondria, they revert back to a more archaic energy system, and there's various things that are turned on within the cell when it becomes damaged. So as a normal cell gets damaged or various genes are turned on, oncogenes that can damage the mitochondria, and as a normal cell transforms into a cancer cell, it relies less on oxidative phosphorylation from the mitochondria and more on substrate level phosphorylation, glycolysis, that occur outside the mitochondria. So that brings me to the point where when we expose these cancer cells to high levels of oxygen, because the mitochondria are damaged in a way, but the damage and glycolysis create an advantage for the cancer cell. So that's a whole other thing I could get into. But and that's some debates around that. But as the cancer cells, because they have damaged mitochondria, as the mitochondria utilize oxygen, they spit out, I guess you could say, a proportionally higher amount of oxygen-free radicals. So I didn't know why this was happening, and I just figured I saw lots of mitochondria in cancer cells, but I didn't realize, they had high rates of reactive oxygen species that they actually use for their growth and proliferation. But cancer cells typically grow in a low oxygen environment. So if we produce a high oxygen environment, that could be a way to increase oxidative stress. So that's the whole kind of using high oxygen. But more importantly, coming back to ketones, is that it was obvious to me that I knew that ketones were metabolized exclusively in the mitochondria to make ATP. And if cancer cells have damaged mitochondria, then in theory, then they shouldn't be able to use ketones effectively as a source of energy as much as normal healthy cells. So cancer cells there's a qualitative and a quantitative effect here. So cancer cells have less mitochondria, and the mitochondria that they have are defective in a way where they do not have the oxidative phosphorylation capacity to make ATP.
So kind of going back to that, providing an alternative
Fuel
fuel substrate.
source.
If you can essentially kind of starving cancer, I guess would be probably a layman's way of putting it, but also providing healthy cells with a alternative substrate of fuel.
Exactly. Nutritional ketosis may be an effective approach. We think of it as a kind of like an adjuvant, so something that can help slow down the growth of cancer, and it does it through a number of ways. Probably the three biggest being it limits glucose availability. So you virtually eliminate or significantly attenuate the spikes in glucose that would typically happen with a carbohydrate feedings. And those spikes in glucose are usually accompanied by spikes in insulin. And we know all scientists, all cancer biologists will pretty much tell you that the levels of glucose and the levels of insulin, for the most part, can drive cancer growth and proliferation. That they are major mitogens that drive cancer growth and proliferation. So these are significantly attenuated with the ketogenic diet and further decreased with calorie restriction, which is in some cases is an important part of the ketogenic diet. And you have an elevation of ketones, which is a little more controversial. Ketones are not a great fuel for most cancer cells, especially that have damaged mitochondria. Some cancer cell lines do express ketolytic enzymes and may use ketones as a source of energy. But ketones have also been shown to inhibit various glycolytic pathways, so they may even further suppress the cancer cell's ability to use glucose as a fuel.
And so you said more of the aggressive cell lines that have
the aggressive phenotype. Yeah. So I guess
so it wouldn't necessarily work for all.
No, I think more indolent cancers, things that like don't show up hot on a PET scan, are probably things that are cells that are not rapidly dividing, are not tumors that are growing fast anyway. I think they would be less responsive, if responsive at all, to the ketogenic diet. So there are some cancer cell lines that have been shown to use fatty acids as a source of energy. And if you're feeding your body fat, right, is that fueling cancer cells? That's a question that we have and that we're looking into. It's important to acknowledge, though, that when you go on a ketogenic diet, typically your blood levels of fat go down. So I know my triglycerides are cut in half. Actually, they were like almost 100, and now they're like 30 or 40, right? So paradoxically,
you probably get better at metabolizing
exactly.
fats.
So eating a high-fat ketogenic diet actually lowers the fats in my blood. So if if someone does have a cancer that is feeding off fat for energy, one of the most effective ways to lower your triglyceride levels would be to go on a carbohydrate-restricted ketogenic diet, because when you're eating carbohydrates, your body will burn the carbohydrates and spare the fats, so the fats will be in your blood and will be feeding the tissues, potentially cancer cells that are thriving off fat.
But this would be in the context of also an overall caloric restriction, right?
Exactly. So that was my next thing. And I believe, you have better insight into this, but I think things like intermittent fasting, things like the ketogenic diet, or carbohydrate restriction, these things, to me personally, and people that I communicate with, make a calorie deficit feasible, make it easier. And I think that's probably the major advantage from maybe a body composition point of view, is that because if you don't have spikes in glucose and insulin, you're not going to have fluctuations in your energy level. You're probably not going to have big cravings. So if you do go hypoglycemic, you're not going to feel it, because the ketones are elevated, kind of keeping your brain happy and energized. And I think for me, that's why I could sit here. So Layne's intermittent fasting right now. He didn't eat since 8. See, he's alert. He's functioning better than I've ever seen him before. So he just admitted to me with
I said 4 shots of whiskey before this is the reason.
And I ate early this morning, so I'm going on about 12 hours of fasting. So
well, actually, I don't do intermittent fasting. One of the things I did in graduate school was
today you are though. Yeah.
Some of my research actually showed that if you like I always used to eat every 2 hours, you know.
Yeah.
And if I went
and
more
nighttime.
than
Remember at nighttime?
if I went more than 2 hours or 2 or 3 hours, I would get hungry.
Yeah.
I said, well, I couldn't eat less frequently because I get hungry. Well, one of my research studies, not to get too long into it, basically kind of said to me, looking at protein synthetic refractoriness, that eating that often was possibly counterproductive. So I switched to eating every 4 to 5 hours, and actually found that I didn't get nearly as hungry because my body is ramping up those endogenous systems that deal with, you know, gluconeogenesis or fuel mobilization. But yeah, I mean, the point you make about caloric restriction is great. I think we both lament how much that, you know, name your diet. You know, intermittent fasting, ketogenic, paleo, vegan. All these things work, but they work because they create a caloric restriction, right? In terms of body composition.
For the most part,
there's
no metabolic advantage of the ketogenic diet. I get asked that question a lot. If you're in a state of heavy ketosis all day, there may be maybe 100 calories of acetoacetate and the ketones in your urine, but that's really not much at all. And it's not enhancing your metabolism in a way that's giving you a metabolic advantage. The big advantage is that it's controlling your appetite, I think, and instead of your appetite controlling you, you know, which was the case with me when I was eating quite frequently, pretty much with rice and fish or rice and chicken. I would get hunger pangs.
Yeah, I mean, there was a study done in 2007. I think it was the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition at Arizona State. Some people argued it wasn't long enough. It was 6 weeks. It was Johnston. And they looked at ketogenic versus non-ketogenic, and they found that body comp outcomes were the same. But pretty much everything was the same. And so I think what that says is, you know, do what you like. You know, if you prefer a ketogenic lifestyle, then it's not going to harm you. You know, like there was some people say, like, we were at the ISSN conference years ago, and somebody was making a big deal about, you know, if you're on a ketogenic diet, your performance is going to drop off. And I actually jumped in and said, well, that's just not true. If you're talking about endurance, you know, once you're keto adapted, it should be relatively the same. You know, like.
I mean, I go to the gym. I haven't been there quite a while, but
this guy's a freak. Don't even.
If your calories are sufficient, unless you train high volume. So my workouts are typically at the most maybe 45 minutes, and I'm not depleting my glycogen in that amount of time.
No.
So
the thing about being ketogenic is you still have glycogen because you make glucose from protein. The muscle will want to store it because you're training, and because you're using mostly fats for fuel, you would store that glycogen.
And even, I mean, during a workout, you know, you are using a little bit of glucose, obviously, because it's anaerobic. You might be running a little bit lower on muscle glycogen, but primarily the glycogen is going to be lower primarily in your liver, and not so much. So your liver glycogen is probably a little less for sure, but muscle glycogen pretty much stays topped off unless you're at a calorie deficit. And if you're supplementing, you know, I do advise like people who start a ketogenic diet to supplement things like creatine monohydrate, which may help them in the gym, because you have a diuretic effect and maybe a loss of some electrolytes that may hit you initially when you get to the gym, and a drop in your blood volume, you become hypovolemic. You're going to have things like orthostatic hypotension. You need to put in a lot of minerals and a lot of fluids to mitigate the effects that you especially get when you start a low-carb ketogenic diet. Because when insulin gets low, and it stays low when you're eating ketogenic, you dump sodium with it. So insulin causes sodium retention, right? So that's why when you're low-carb and you eat a lot of carbs and you blow up, you're not getting fat, you're retaining water, because that sodium is causing the reabsorption of a lot of water and retention of water. So these are kind of things that people may not, you know, fully acknowledge, but when you go ketogenic, you got to drink lots of water, lots of sodium, even to maintain the water. I think even taking creatine, from my personal experience, loading up on creatine when you start helps too.
Yeah, well, and that's great points. And I think, you know, what we would say is, like, basically do what you prefer. When it comes to body composition. Body comes to performance.
And it's do what you preference thing too.
Yeah,
right?
I
like
more
fatty
fats,
foods, you know.
But understanding that, like, I would tell people that if you are going to go to a ketogenic lifestyle, to do so with the understanding that it is a lifestyle, and that if you're going to be somebody who's going to be trying it, I want to do ketogenic for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever, it's probably not be good
Yeah.
to be kicking yourself in and out of ketosis, here and there.
You're not going to get the full benefits of it because you really have to adhere and sustain to it for a period of time for all the full benefits to manifest. So the longer you do it, there's a learning curve, the easier it gets and the more benefits you derive from it. So you really got to stick with it for a period of time, and then after that you can decide.
And adherence is an individual thing, and the number one thing for dietary success is adherence. That's it. So for some people like me, I do better with more flexibility, and the more foods I can, like, I love my ice cream. I love, but I can include that, and I can be restricted insofar as, insofar as tracking. Also, some people, that is more restrictive to them psychologically to have to track and do those sorts of things, whereas they can say, you know what, if I eat ketogenic, I'm going to self-restrict. Because it's going to be hard to overeat when I'm completely eliminating a food group. Yeah. Now you can do it.
I eat ketogenic ice cream though, and ketogenic cookies every night. And so that's the world of. There's a lot of industries popping up now that are making ketogenic brownies, ketogenic cookies, keto cookie, keto brownie. Look that up. These are things I think I eat every single night. I eat a ketogenic brownie, a keto cookie, and. No Foods had to create a whole line of like really low carb things. So there's an emerging market right now that actually making these comfort foods that would make following a ketogenic diet feasible and enjoyable and not hard at all. So I think that's what's new. That's what didn't exist 5 years 100%. Ago, and now that exists now.
And keep in mind again, these are not high protein foods. These are low to moderate protein, low carb, high fat. So, not necessarily for my macro people out there, not necessarily macro friendly, especially if you're restricting fat. But real quick, one more point I wanted to cover, because this was something that came up recently, and you're talking about ketogenic products. So there was a study done where they gave ketone esters to cyclists, and they saw a drop in performance.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have been taking the study, plastering it all over Facebook, and to me, when I looked at this stuff, I always said, like I said to you, it would make sense that an alternate fuel source might provide some advantages, and there was some other studies that showed that they did provide some advantages. And when research is contradictory, my first inclination is not to say, well, somebody's made this up. My first thing is to go, okay, let's look at the study design. So, can you? What would? Do you have any comments or anything that could explain the differences between the studies in terms of performance?
Yeah, I think so. I know this. I think it's a good example of what not to do. So, if I'm going to compete in a race or expect to use a substance that I would call an ergogenic aid and expect to have an increase in performance, I would want to test that agent on myself to assess my tolerance to it, my tolerability, and I'll probably do a dose response to figure out what I can tolerate and how to use it, right? So you wouldn't want to run a marathon and take a new substance that would upset your stomach and then expect to perform to have a performance enhancement, using it. And that's kind of what we get with the study. And I understand the reasons why I think they associated the ingestion of the ketone ester with a GI upset. Mm-hmm. These things are expensive to produce. They're made in limited quantities. You don't want to spend, money on 10 liters of ketone ester to figure out what's optimized. So and that's, I learn a lot from looking at these studies because I'm working in various capacities to assist different labs to understand. So there's many different types of ketones out there, dozens of different varieties of ketones, ketone salts, and these things are formulated in different ways, and even different types of ketone esters. I can think of a half dozen different. So I think what we need to understand as a community, I'm primarily working on therapeutic applications, but also some performance applications, is to vet out what types of ketones actually may have an ergogenic effect, and to understand their dose response curves and their tolerability, and to firmly study in the population from a pharmacokinetic standpoint and tolerability before actually giving it to a subject and expecting them to perform better in an exercise test.
Right, and it's no different. Like I've had people who don't take caffeine during training, and all of a sudden they're before a meet they want to take a big thing of caffeine, and I'm like, it's a bad idea. You have no idea what it's going to do. Like, and even if it works the way it's supposed to, you might be shaky. You might not know how to handle it. You know, like it's not a good idea. It's it's probably good to understand how you respond and then taper it or something like that.
I did the same thing with glucose. So I'm on a ketogenic diet. I've been on a ketogenic diet for like 8 or 9 years. So I was testing different ketone esters and different ketone supplements, and I wanted to figure out what kind of performance advantage I would have if I took 60 grams of glucose with the ketone ester. And when I did that, I took the glucose, it made me absolutely sick to my stomach. It gave me nausea and cramps, and my blood glucose, I got the shakes. I remember it gave me a kind of a flashback of when I used to eat carbs and I went hypoglycemic, I would start sweating and shaking, and I got this reaction. So it's kind of an idea, this idea that you really need to train with something and test it, especially if you're going to test it and do a study on it.
It's also like no different in competition. Like you wouldn't just buy a new belt that you've never used before and use that on the day of nationals,
or use a diuretic.
So
I know you promote like water restriction and not drinking. And
no.
But I mean,
somebody, can we get the gangster glasses coming down over Dom?
But I mean, I'm sure you hear, and back when I used to, follow bodybuilding, that people would come up to the time of competition and they would take a diuretic and get cramps and all these side effects, and never had to use the diuretic before.
Yeah, well, they change 80 different variables, and then they wonder why they don't look as good at competition as they did in the gym, and it's like, well, duh,
Or even water restriction, or water, or drinking a lot of water.
Yeah, cutting sodium, all that kind of stuff.
All these different things. You don't expect a positive outcome if you introduce something that's new to your physiology, right? A new kind of, literally an alternative fuel.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, like, you can look at anything that I'll just give one example before we finish up. I saw a poster at EB a few years back. Actually, I think it's the one we went to. So 10 years ago. And it showed that people who were following a high-carb diet were better at clearing a glucose challenge than a high-fat diet. And their conclusion was that that a high-fat diet impairs insulin sensitivity. And I walked right up to the guy. I was like, this isn't what your data says at all. Mm-hmm. What it says is these people are better adapted to glucose metabolism.
Yeah.
And these people are better adapted to fat metabolism. And you challenge them with glucose. Mm-hmm. Of course they didn't clear it well. Do the reverse. Challenge both groups with a fat challenge and see which one clears it faster. Mm-hmm. And I promise you it'll be the group that has. So it's whatever your body's adapted to. People ask me all the time, like for example, does body comp make a difference between carbohydrates or fats, if protein and calories are equated? We don't think so, but I think one thing that's important to say is whatever carb-fat breakdown you choose, be consistent with that. Because even if you're not ketogenic, if you're fluctuating wildly from higher fat to lower fat, from higher carb to lower carb, from day to day, I think that's probably going to be really hard for your body to get in a rhythm and get adapted to and perform well with.
Maybe. I promote, this idea of metabolic flexibility too. So I think it may be good to do intermittent ketosis. So follow the ketogenic diet for a period of time to maybe get some of the body composition changes. And that literally makes, changes in your physiology that I believe that, carries over in other, you've probably did clients, I remember you telling me, like, the first time you diet, it gets easier every time. Like, your body kind of knows what to do. And sort of the same thing. I could say the same thing with fasting, right? So the first time you fast is kind of hard. The first time you do it, it's very painful. But then when you do it again, it's like your body knows kind of what to do. It almost it feels like your body knows what to do. And it's literally not only painless, but kind of enjoyable. It's
PTSD.
But there's people do fasting for different reasons.
Yeah, I get what
I kind of did it initially because I wanted to understand this whole idea
because
of fasting ketosis. fasting, I mean, I could do a whole podcast on why fasting is anabolic. Do you want to do that?
We'll do that tomorrow. We'll do that tomorrow.
I'm just trolling Layne here. But,
troll me all the time.
But
well, so
it
if
does
you
reset insulin sensitivity, at least to some extent, and that could be depending. But I mean, we could chat about that on the podcast.
So, I guess people just give them a quick breakdown of like what you do and what you recommend for a ketogenic diet, for the modified ketogenic diet.
Okay, well, I don't recommend people do what I do. But what I do, and feedback from other people, things that have worked, is that the classical ketogenic diet is something that you don't want to do unless you're metabolically managing like epilepsy or another. That's a clinical ketogenic diet that you need a consultant for and medical advice for. So I personally follow a modified ketogenic diet. The macronutrient ratios vary from about 25% to 30%, some days, up to 35%. The balance of calories being from a mix of different types of fats, and my carbohydrates come from green vegetables, salads, cauliflower, mashed potatoes, asparagus. I have a little bit of berries every night, probably. And
when he says cauliflower mashed potatoes, he means he takes cauliflower, steams the crap out of it, and makes it like mashed potatoes.
Yeah.
Not that he uses mashed potatoes as a source.
Yeah, so what I advise to people is like pick the foods, write down the food, if you want to do the ketogenic diet, write down the foods that you like, and actually take those foods and make it into a ketogenic diet. It's a lot easier than if you like chicken and steak and things like that. So you get steak that's fatty cut, you get chicken with the skin on it, you get fatty fish. If you like mashed potatoes, do cauliflower mashed potatoes. If you like, brownies, get a keto brownie, get keto cookies. So these foods are emerging too. But typically kind of pick the foods that you like, the low carb version, and add fat to it. So when you cook your spinach or broccoli, you can put lots of butter on it. When you do your salad, don't use the non-fat dressing. Use like maybe an MCT based oil, and medium chain triglycerides are ketogenic fats, so that can help your body boost in ketones. So there are little tricks, and there's tons of ketogenic diet books out there that have recipes. There's, website. My website, ketonutrition.org, has lots of resources on there, and a half dozen or more different books that allow you, any person really, to implement the ketogenic diet in ways that I think are palatable and enjoyable.
Cool. Well, I don't do the ketogenic diet. I love my carb foods, but I think what I want to close with is that there is no one size fits all, and everything is tools in the tool belt. And if I had some kind of metabolic abnormality like cancer, like seizures, epilepsy, Alzheimer's, or type 1 diabetes, I would consider a ketogenic diet because it is a tool in a tool belt. Yeah. And I think you guys always need to remember, like, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Just because some people irresponsibly promote the ketogenic diet and give it properties that it doesn't have, doesn't mean it's a complete waste of time. And I see this too much in nutritional science. Just like I wouldn't say fasting is necessarily a waste. We don't know everything. So everything's tools in a tool belt.
In regards to cancer, I just want to interject real quick. So the ketogenic diet is not a cure for cancer. So make that very clear. I promote it whenever we study the ketogenic diet. It's an adjuvant to something else. So it can further augment the therapeutic efficacy of standard of care therapies, which you should do if your type of cancer has been shown to be responsive to standard of care. By all means, use the standard of care therapies. The things that we study are relatively resistant to standard of care, metastatic cancer, brain cancer, but we are studying the ketogenic diet, or what we call nutritional ketosis, diet and supplementation, as an adjuvant to the standard of care to enhance it. So
and I've never heard you say it's a cure. People put those words in your mouth.
No, yeah, I know.
Well, thanks, Dom. We appreciate it. This is
appreciate
awesome.
Here,
and what did you say they could find you again?
Keto Nutrition, all one word, .org. So I have a lot of resources on there. There's consultants, there's clinical trials, there's how-to books, there's doctors on there. A lot of information about what we talked about today.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it. It's a lot of fun.